Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Rami Khoudi, director of the South Paris Institute, AUB, and I'd like to welcome you all, and pleasure to have you at this inaugural event of the Bill and Sally Hambrecht Distinguished Peacemakers Lectures at AUB. This is a 2-year series of lectures that we are launching, and Alvaro de Soto is our first distinguished peacemaker. Distinguished doesn't mean you're always successful. It means you're capable, credible, honest, dynamic, and as he will explain to us, sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail, but whenever you try peacemaking and mediation, you learn something. And the object of this 2-year lecture series is to invite distinguished peacemakers who have worked as mediators, third-party mediators, all over the world, and to have them come to AUB, spend a couple of days, give a public lecture, interact with conflict resolutions, people all over the country and from other parts of the Arab world who will come in. We have quite a lineup of people that we are talking to. We haven't officially announced any other names yet, and I will just mention a few, but any of you who are in the press don't actually print the names yet because they're not confirmed. But we're talking to Bishop Tutu, Mary Robinson, George Mitchell, Lieutenant Brahimi, Amr Musa, a very serious range of Yana Yassin, and other prominent and experienced mediators from the UN and third countries, from Ed Durigian and Aaron Miller from the United States. A range of people who have worked all over the world and have tremendous experience. And we want to learn the lessons. What makes a good mediator? What should mediators not do? What should they do? And particularly to learn lessons from other parts of the world so we can use that information to bring to bear to conflict resolution and peacemaking in the Middle East, where, mashallah, there's a lot of peacemaking to be done, and hopefully some of it will succeed. So that's the basic aim of this. Bill and Sally Hambrecht generously funded this series. We will produce a book at the end of the 2 years with all of the lectures, with a serious introduction by a conflict resolution scholar, and make that book freely available to people all over the world, again, who are at libraries and conflict resolution experts or practitioners and NGOs, whatever, and governments. And we'll certainly be sure to send a copy to a lot of governments who do a lot of mediation so that they learn the lessons as well. But we're very pleased to have as our first speaker Alvaro de Soto. Among Alvaro de Soto's assets is that he and I went to the same high school in Geneva, Switzerland. But he's older and wiser than I am. That's why he's making the lecture. I just do the introduction. We went to the International School of Geneva, and he graduated about 5-6 years before me. But I'm not surprised that he's gone on to a career of diplomacy and active peacemaking and mediation. It's one of the things that we pick up, I think, from going to a high school with 52 nationalities, as it was in our days back in the late 50s and early 60s. But he's gone on to a distinguished career in diplomacy. He's a national of Peru, and he was in the Peruvian Foreign Service. And then joined the United Nations, has been in the UN for 25 years, just recently retired from the UN. And he's had many senior posts in the Secretariat, working with 3 different Secretaries General, and most recently was Under Secretary General and United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, and has worked previously in the mediation in Cyprus, where he and his colleagues achieved the formula that was presented for a referendum but didn't succeed, was not accepted, but did some very serious work in Cyprus, which is one of the toughest issues in the world these days, along with Palestine and others. He succeeded with his colleagues and others in mediating a peace in El Salvador, which was really one of the great breakthroughs in modern, not just peacemaking, but in conflict resolution with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and how to achieve a negotiated peace and then make sure it sticks. And this is one of the areas where he did succeed. He's worked in Western Sahara, he's worked in Myanmar, Burma, and other places. So we're delighted to have him as our inaugural speaker. He'll talk for somewhere around 30, maximum 40 minutes. These former UN bureaucrats, you give them a stage and a microphone and off they go. But we told them that we're here not just with distinguished peacemakers, but with distinguished audience, and many of our distinguished audience have to go to class at 1 o'clock or 1:30. So he'll speak 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up, and we can go to around 1:30 or something like that. This is an on-the-record talk, so anything that's said here is free to be reported or discussed. We're taping it. It'll be available archivally. The entire lecture series will be put on our website in audio and video, and we will archive it, and if future students and scholars want to work on these issues, they will have access to it. And we are working, by the way, next spring, we hope, on a course at AUB that will build on the other speakers who are going to come, to have a course in conflict resolution, to use the speakers that we bring as assets for the course. So again, I thank Bill and Sally Hambrecht for the generous support, and I particularly want to say a word of thanks to 3 other people. One is our benefactor, Essam Faris, who has given quite a sum of money to establish the Essam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and President Waterbury and the provost of AUB. We owe them a lot for getting this institute going. So I'm very grateful to the President and Provost and to Essam Faris, and we're getting ready to launch a major series of activities and ongoing programs at the Essam Faris Institute at AUB. So I will turn it over to Alvaro de Soto, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Rami. I'm honored and slightly daunted by being the first in a series of, quote, distinguished peacemakers, unquote, as the program mentions it. I'm not sure whether it will set a high standard or from here on everything will be uphill. But in any case, I'm very Rami, you have unfortunately given a hint that there's a form of nepotism involved in this, since we are old classmates. On the other hand, I am delighted that you should have felt the need to point out that I am more ancient than you are. Which makes clear that it is not readily apparent to the naked eye. Now, the director of the Essam Faris Institute has pointed out to you, as mentioned, some of the issues in which I have been involved with the United Nations. I should probably mention that in putting together the title of this presentation, he very much insisted on adding at the end the words "on 3 continents." And I'm very glad also that he has sort of played down expectations by saying for me what I otherwise would have said, which is that in this line of work, the success rate is measured not in the numbers of issues of conflicts or disputes actually solved. You get kudos at the end of the road for just trying. And of course, part of the work of a peacemaker involves knowing how and when to blame the parties to the actual conflict, who are, of course, ultimately those who have to solve the problem. And one of the lessons that one can draw very quickly from any involvement in this line of work is that not all conflicts lend themselves to mediation or to third-party intervention. Many times, the parties to a conflict or a dispute can and should sort out things amongst themselves, which is, of course, the ideal scenario, if they can do it. Third-party mediation is required, or third-party good offices, a broader term, widely used at the United Nations, is usually required when the degree of suspicion is very, very high, and there's a high degree of mistrust. Now, I've been involved in El Salvador, which was one case where there was little or no communication between the parties, who were in fact fighting at the time the negotiations took place, wartime negotiations. In fact, I was just mentioning to someone earlier that one issue that is worthwhile studying seriously is by people who are involved in the study of conflict resolution is a comparison of the dynamics between wartime negotiations and peacetime negotiations. Now, in my experience, wartime negotiations have a lot of advantages, cynical as that may sound, because as long as the bullets are flying, people are being killed, and particularly when you have egregious acts, you can get the attention of the 16th member of the Security Council. Of course, there's competition. It used to be that CNN was referred to as the 16th member of the Security Council. There's a lot more competition for that title now between CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and Al Arabiya, and others. But you can get the attention of that, and public opinion plays an important role in mobilizing negotiating efforts and drawing attention to conflicts. It's more difficult to get the attention of the international community to trying to find a solution for a dispute such as Cyprus, where that isn't happening. No shots have been fired in anger there for a long time, years, and when they were, it was an isolated incident, and it was possible to manage it. So those are a few of the points that one can pick up right away. But I should point out that perhaps it's a little bit early for me to speak about lessons learned, because what I am hoping to do in the coming year or so is to take time to reflect. And so I am only beginning to draw lessons, and I may come to conclusions that are far more rounded out or better elaborated, more scientifically, I hope, in a period of time. Now, what I come to this work, I come to talk to you from the perspective of someone who has conducted good offices on behalf of the UN Secretary General. There are certain rules of thumb that normally should apply to anyone who is involved in trying to solve a dispute or a conflict, which are quite basic, such as impartiality, such as the need for acceptance by the parties, not just for the concept of the third-party involvement, but also for the individual organization or institution that is carrying out that, or person that is carrying out that exercise in good office. Those are basic rules that are applicable almost to any mediator. Now, of course, like any rule worthy of its name, there are exceptions. And I can point to one immediately, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which lasts still, where you have the curious phenomenon of Israel preferring to deal directly, face to face, with the Palestinians if they deal with them, when they deal with them at all, but who will tolerate one particular mediator, and that is, of course, the United States, for reasons that are well known. There are very close links between Israel and the United States, and Israel feels comfortable that they won't be sold down the river by the United States, but rather that they will get the support that an ally provides to another. The Palestinians are, of course, perfectly well aware that the United States has a sort of a parti pris in their conflict. But they accept the United States. Indeed, they have, until now, encouraged the involvement of the United States for reasons of their own, because they believe that if any third party can ever deliver Israel, it could be the United States. Now, this has not, of course, prevented both parties from actually being drawn into a process due to the discrete efforts of one particular government, the government of Norway, which led to the Oslo peace accords. But going back to my earlier point, impartiality, acceptance of the mediating institution and the person that is conducting the effort is critical. Now, this, of course, immediately points to the fact that whereas I was the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, I don't think that it can be said that in any way, shape, or form the United Nations was actually a mediator. So, in a sense, in professional terms, following my role in El Salvador, following my role in Cyprus, where the United Nations was clearly in the lead of the negotiations, and this was accepted by all, and there were mandates from the Security Council, explicit or implicit. In the Middle East, that is not the case at all. The United Nations doesn't play such a role. It plays more of a peripheral shepherding role, and which has now been subsumed in the last few years into the quartet, but more on that a little bit later. The United Nations Secretary General, in the last few years, you could easily come to believe is sort of the world's default peacemaker, that essentially the world's chief diplomat, because of the involvement of the Secretary General himself and or through his envoys in trying to solve a number of disputes in various parts of the world. Now, that may be as it seems, but if actually you backtrack only a few years, I think you will realize that actually there's been a revival in UN peacemaking because the United Nations essentially did not do this kind of thing until fairly recently. And in fact, if you look at the first 40 years of the United Nations or so, let's say it will be closer to 30 or 35, actually, you will find only one case where the United Nations actually played a role in brokering an armistice to a conflict. And that was, of course, the Middle East. The UN's Ralph Bunche mediated through a formula of shuttling where the parties did not meet each other on the island of Rhodes, so therefore not too far from here, an armistice that ended the 1948 war, and it led to setting up one of the UN's oldest observation positions under the broad category of peacekeeping, headquartered in Jerusalem, UNSO. But since then, because of the Cold War, which essentially froze any capacity of the Secretary General to carry out peacemaking activities, very little happened. There were episodes where seeming miracles were performed. Hammarskjöld, for instance, during the Korean War when a plane went down and a number of U.S. airmen found themselves stranded in China and captured, took the initiative at a time when Beijing was not holding the Chinese seat as a permanent member of the Security Council, to go there nonetheless on his own initiative, and managed actually to, after a period of time, to negotiate their release. And there were episodes of that nature, including the involvement in trying to sort out the war that broke out shortly after independence in what had been the Belgian Congo, and where they are at eternal war still and or again these days. But other than that, the United Nations had very little of a role. And of course there was a reason, there are good reasons for this, including the fact that due to, and I'm speaking in very broad historical sweeps here, in Africa, for instance, there was an outright competition between major powers for spheres of influence. And one of the manifestations of that competition was to win over the favors of individual African leaders, and therefore propping up the head of state or the presidential institutions and their Praetorian guards, and therefore managing to avoid the outbreak of the conflicts that would have derived from the somewhat arbitrary, to put it mildly, divisions across ethnic and tribal divisions in Africa. So conflicts of the type that now proliferate were pretty much tamped down in Africa. The same, one didn't hear about ethnic problems in what used to be the Soviet Union, of the kind that had broken out since the end of the Cold War. And also, Yugoslavia was kept together in part by the Cold War, in part by the personality and clout of Tito. The end of the Cold War, which was celebrated by all of us, had its everyone was, of course, relieved that the threat of all of us dying as a result of nuclear war between the two superpowers has not been without its drawbacks, without its sort of downside, consisting of the fact that the elimination of that competition, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of what used to be Yugoslavia, have translated into a lot of conflicts that were sort of swept under the carpet or kept down by the powers that be, now coming to the surface. To the point where, at the United Nations, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, because of the explosion of UN peacemaking and peacekeeping business, there's a certain amount of nostalgia for certain aspects of the Cold War. And in fact, we're talking about a quarter century is a rather pretentious way of referring to 25 years. I worked with 3 secretaries general. I worked intimately with one, very closely for a time, for 2 or 3 years with another, and in certain episodes, hand in glove with a third. And there is you can actually identify certain historical moments at which each one of them was in charge of the United Nations. Berezequia who started in 1982 and continued until the end of 1991, was handling the period of transition from the Cold War into the end of the Cold War. You can almost put bookmarks there. He started his stewardship of the United Nations under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and when he ended in 1991, the Berlin Wall had fallen. The United Nations had already played an important role in brokering the removal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Namibia came to independence, and we started to get involved in something that would have been unheard of a few years before, which was the Central American conflicts, which were handled by the United Nations. And in fact, a curious thing happened when Pérez de Cuellar's term ended in late 1991, that within a month, the new Secretary General, Boutros Ghali of Egypt, had on a silver platter offered to him an extraordinary opportunity, which was firstly a summit for the first time ever of the Security Council. The Security Council met with the purpose, in part at least, to give a first-class funeral to the Cold War. And also, since already new opportunities were arising for the United Nations, the El Salvador Peace Accords had just been signed, and we were setting up a multi-dimensional operation that was going to oversee the implementation of the agreements that had been reached during the negotiations. We were starting to get involved in the former Yugoslavia, which was sort of the stage for some of the United Nations slip-ups, but I can get to that, or we can deal with that in questions and answers if you are interested. And it seemed as if the United Nations could essentially handle everything. Back in Hammarskjöld's time, when there were small crises, the saying was started to be bruited about, leave it to die. This is an issue that can be handled by die. You could almost feel, a hope at the United Nations that kind of an era was coming back to the United Nations. There was almost a touch of hubris. The Secretary General at that summit was asked to make recommendations to member states as to how to enhance, how to strengthen the capacity of the United Nations in peacemaking, peacekeeping, and preventive diplomacy. And he produced a report that had considerable impact and an agenda for peace at the time. Some of you may recall it. And it was a report that was ambitious but realistic at the same time. And he added there a very important concept that was, at least in part, inspired by the El Salvador experience, which is what he called post-conflict peacebuilding. Now, this is, we all know what peacemaking is, and we all know what preventive action or preventive diplomacy is, and we know what peacekeeping is, because there's an old UN tradition, and we're all accustomed to seeing the images of blue helmets or blue berets, including in, perhaps particularly in Lebanon. But what is post-conflict peacebuilding? It is what some scholars are now referring to part of the jus post bellum, that is, the duties regarding the aftermath of wars. And an ethos has developed since the early 90s to the effect that it should be part of the duty of the Secretary General or the envoy who is handling a conflict or dispute for him to ensure not just that guns are silenced or that an agreement will be reached that will patch together the dispute, but to make sure that it will be durable, that it will sustain the test of time, that it will last, for which one must address the root causes. One has to carry out an analytical exercise in order to inquire what it is that led to conflict in the first place, and therefore what are the problems that need to be addressed so that in the future a conflict will not recur. Using from my experience in El Salvador, for instance, if you wanted to summarize it in a single clause, the problem was exclusionary policies. That is, that certain sectors of society that were essentially either repressed or dissented from the way things were being handled through a framework, an institutional framework that gave an enormous role to the armed forces, who were essentially the ultimate arbiter, even according to the constitution of politics, and where there was no real framework in order to ensure respect for human rights. Those were the things that needed to be addressed, and they were, in fact, in rather comprehensive accords addressed. Institutions were provided, new ones, national civilian police, an ombudsman. Other institutions were profoundly reformed, such as the armed forces. The judicial system was also reformed, and even the electoral system, in order to broaden and open it out. And today, it is possible to see former negotiators from the guerrillas who rose up in arms because there was no other way of handling the problems of repression, are in the parliament, and they have almost a majority within the parliament, and there is rational and civilized discourse between them and the party that is actually controlling the executive. So this is sort of the philosophy of post-conflict buildings, ensuring that once the guns are silent, that they will remain silent, and that therefore it can be assured that conflict will not recur, and which can involve also obviously intensified activities of cooperation, bilateral and multilateral, with the state concerned, almost always a developing country or two developing countries, to ensure that development within a peacetime development can be restored, because otherwise it will be difficult for the peace to last. You need the country to, or countries concerned, to develop and to sort of be put on the launching pad again. But there are other aspects, such as how do you handle the past? It is a frequent problem. I was saying to, speaking to someone earlier, and quoting from Winston Churchill, who used to say about the Balkans, or let's say it's a quote attributed to him. There are perhaps more quotes attributed to Winston Churchill even than to Woody Allen and Yogi Berra. There's a competition there, but it is, I believe, said that the problem in the Balkans is that there is too much history and too little geography. I found since then that observation is also applicable certainly to Cyprus and definitely to the Middle East. Too much history, too little geography, not enough real estate to pass around. And sometimes in the past, serious misdeeds have occurred, frequently on all sides. Now, what do? You just turn the page and move on? Is it possible to do so? Can a peaceful solution to a conflict, or negotiated solution to a conflict, be achieved if it does not address these problems? Those are questions which I would like to reflect on further. My sense, my preliminary sense, is that you have to provide some sort of an outlet, and at the minimum, it should be some sort of agreed authoritative mechanism or process for getting a clarification that is more or less broadly tolerated or accepted an official version of what actually happened. Whether you proceed to attribution of responsibility, whether you have to judge these things, that is another matter that you have to judge on a case-by-case basis. The case that is most often quoted is that of South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which they mixed the sort of the cathartic, very public truth-telling with a judicial element by getting people to actually confess publicly to what they had done. Will it work in other cases? I'm not sure. Each one has to be tailored probably to the particular needs. Now, there's also another problem that arises, particularly for UN envoys, and I will explain why, is the question of human rights violations during a conflict. Human rights violations of the laws of war. Now, this is a very difficult one, and the sort of the inclination of most people who are involved in the trade in which I've been involved for a few decades now are inclined to say that peace is an overriding goal. It supersedes any other goal. The only thing that is really important, the highest priority, is to stopping the fighting, because it's the fighting from which come most violations. Yes, but for the United Nations Secretary General, this is more complicated. Strictly speaking, for any government that's involved in negotiation, because they are all bound by the UN Charter, they are all bound by the framework of human rights and humanitarian laws that have emerged in the course of the life of the United Nations. In the case of the Secretary General, however, the obligations are of a, say, higher degree because the Secretary General, who is in a sense the personification of the United Nations, he has a responsibility or a duty to uphold that law that puts a heavier weight and heavier responsibility on his shoulders to ensure certain things. And therefore, after having deliberated internally on this matter for a period of time, for the late 90s, mid-90s, the Secretary General has issued guidelines under which every United Nations envoy, every Secretary General's envoy, carries in his portfolio certain instructions. And these instructions are that the United Nations, in their essence, this has been made public, that the United Nations cannot be associated with deals, either open or backroom, between to provide an amnesty for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. We simply have to walk away. And the threat of walking away, which of course it is left to the discretion of the envoy to wield at a time of his or her choosing, has a certain credibility, because the Secretary General, among his comparative advantages, is that he has a certain drawing power over the United Nations system and can actually convene international efforts, convene and lead international efforts in order to bring about the kind of assistance that is required, not only for implementation of agreements, but also to ensure that the aid for the implementation of agreements and also the development needs can be met. Now, you will no doubt be asking yourselves by this time, why am I not talking a little bit more about the Middle East, which is really what everybody is interested in at this time. And let me turn to that rather briefly. The question of the independence of the Secretary General which probably applies to any mediator, but certainly has to apply to the Secretary General. It's the, let's say, the other side of the coin of impartiality, the non-susceptibility, or desirable, or even required non-susceptibility to external influence of the Secretary General. I think this is a fundamental point. Should be the very lifeblood of the Secretary General and his envoys. There are not only reasons of law for this. Under the Charter in Article 100, there is an injunction not on the Secretary General, but also on member states, which says each member of the United Nations undertakes to respect the exclusive international character of the responsibilities of the Secretary General and the staff, and not to seek to influence them in the discharge of their responsibilities. Now, frequently one draws attention to the famous Article 99, which the last Secretary General of the League of Nations so envied, which is Article 99, which allows the Secretary General to bring matters which he believes may threaten international peace and security to the attention of the Security Council. This is indeed a very important power, not just because of the formal act of bringing something to the attention of the Security Council, which is not frequently done because the Security Council has on its menu already almost anything in any issue imaginable, but also because it implies that he has to have the necessary resources, the necessary ability in order to form an opinion on whether something may threaten international peace and security. But I think that Article 100 is actually more important in many ways because it is the legal protection on the part of the Secretary General from receiving instructions or from swaying in the direction of one or another. And there is even a practical reason for this, and I will give you one or two examples. And it is that these days in particular, everyone can see whether the Secretary General or his envoy is tilting to one side or another in the third-party intervention in a dispute. It's all transparent. And this is not something new. In late 1989, when we were approached in parallel by the government of El Salvador and the insurrectionist coalition, the FMLN, about the possibility of the United Nations playing a third-party role when all other would-be mediators had pretty much fallen by the wayside, the FMLN asked me some very prying questions about the Secretary General's handling in the initial stages of the process that eventually led to the independence of Namibia. I can, if you wish, go further into the details of it. So you have here an insurrectionist movement in a small country in Central America, actually inquiring how the Secretary General behaves himself in the handling of a dispute in a place that is very far away. For what purpose? In order to ensure that the Secretary General was actually impartial, could actually hold out against pressure when they were about to go into a negotiating process with a government whose army was bankrolled, trained, and financed by a permanent member of the Security Council. In the same way, it occurs to me, to deal with, to refer to a very current problem. I suspect that the generals in Burma, or Myanmar as it now calls itself, will be watching very carefully to see whether the standards to which they are being held up are also being applied to others. That is relevant. Or when it's a question of let's say, democratic principles and democracy, or the search for more open societies is more and more frequently becoming a goal of peace efforts under the theory that democratic societies are less conflict prone, people will be asking questions about the attitude of the international community regarding the election in January 2006 of Hamas to the government of the Palestinian Authority, which brought to the international community through the quartet to a position which is widely interpreted by the Palestinians and beyond as a collective punishment of the Palestinian people for the way the people voted. Now that's one problem that's gnawing me at me. Another problem that is gnawing at me, and on which I would like to give much further thought, and I would encourage a discussion, is how does the United Nations handle the various and disparate activities of the United Nations? I could quote for you from a recent speech by the Commissioner General of UNRWA, which coordinates assistance to the Palestinian refugees, in which she speaks of the conflict between humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and particularly to the political action by the United Nations and the pitfalls that are involved in it. You will recall that having been established in the late 40s, UNRWA and the UN system moved after the Oslo Accord, which offered a prospect of the creation of a Palestinian administration and eventually a state. The assistance started to shift toward activities that promoted the ability of the Palestinians themselves to administer them with quasi-state institutions. As of the moment that the quartet gave signs that perhaps certain requirements should be fulfilled by the new Palestinian government before it was able to receive assistance, it shifted back to humanitarian assistance, leaving aside the fact that it was actually the Palestinian salaried doctors, teachers, and nurses that provided to the Palestinian people the bulk of assistance in terms of education and their medical needs, and that they were being, because of these policies of the international community and the way they were interpreted by Israel, they were being deprived of those salaries. And so there are contradictions there that are pretty dramatic, and one could debate, I think, whether the standards were being respected. And this puts the United Nations, of course, in a difficult situation, because on the one hand we are providing or coordinating the provision of humanitarian assistance, and at the same time, through the UN's association with the quartet, in a sense, collaborating in the creation of the situation that led to the need for this humanitarian assistance. Which brings me to another problem that is sort of gnawing at me, and it is the whole question of, and with this I will conclude, the whole question of dealing with organizations that find themselves on lists of terrorists. Now, they are not a new thing. It mostly concerns the European Union and individual states, certainly the United States. Now, the United Nations has traditionally talked to everybody. We've done it in Cambodia, in the former Yugoslavia, in Mozambique, you name it, because that's the way the work of peace is carried out. You need to inclusively gather around the same table those who need to agree to the solution of conflict, with the caveats that I mentioned earlier. But since 9/11 in particular, I detect that, let's say, the stigma that's associated with dealing with organizations that are on these lists has, let's say, been highlighted to the point where it really became, certainly in the West, bad form or not good form to deal with certain organizations, in particular in the Middle East. And the United Nations found itself inhibited from dealing with the new Palestinian government that emerged from the January 2006 elections, which rather complicated its task in trying to help, as part of the quartet and because of its own sort of inherent responsibilities, bring about some sort of a solution. How can you bring it about if you're not dealing with them? For me, in particular, it was personally awkward because I was, as part of my extremely lengthy title, personal representative of the Secretary General to the Palestinian Authority, whereas I was unable to meet with its leader or the members of the cabinet that were affiliated with Hamas. Now that is a problem. It is a serious drawback for peacemakers, and it's another of those problems that will, I think, come under very careful scrutiny for possible future candidates for being mediated, if I can put it that way. So, in my view, there are certain standards which must be met by pretty much all mediators. There are some specific standards that individual mediators, governments, the Norways and Switzerlands of this world, Turkeys perhaps, and that even the NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are involved in this, the Comunità Sant'Egidio, which is largely the broker of the Mozambique peace accords, Humanitarian Dialogue, and others that are involved in these activities, the Carter Center, they also have certain duties, but the Secretary General has a responsibility to uphold these standards. In particular, more than anything, because he's got to lead by example. And also, and on this I will conclude, I believe that it's particularly important for the Secretary General and for the United Nations to follow and to stand by what has been achieved by predecessors. Because if you look at the Charter, you will find that it is nowhere stated, nor is it stated anywhere in United Nations legislation, that the Secretary General in fact has a default role as the world's chief diplomat. He doesn't actually have it. And it is an activity that I think is very valuable because the Secretary General has obvious comparative advantages, but won't necessarily last. And I don't think it is desirable that the international community should be deprived of a potentially very important tool in the peacemaking toolbox. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. There's a couple of seats here. People there want to sit down. We'll open the floor for questions, preferably. If you want to make a comment, you have to be very short. I will cut you off quickly on comments, but questions really is what we would like. And please identify yourselves and over there first. Yes. Could you just wait for the microphone because this is being taped at the beginning.
Joseph Hello, Senior Economics. My question particularly was that in situations where the disintegration of the state is the case, such as Lebanon in 1975 and post-1975, didn't the UN face many vicissitudes in trying to negotiate with the parties engaged in the conflict, specifically when they were non-governmental actors? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I understood the United Nations. What is this specific question?
Didn't the United Nations face difficulties specifically when they have to mediate or they have to negotiate between non-governmental actors, such as in Lebanon in 1982 when the Palestinians were in the south, or when,
Yes, for the United Nations, it is always difficult to become involved in internal conflict, particularly when it involves non-state actors. There's no question about that. We have basically two rules of thumb regarding international conflict. The first one is obvious and it applies to any would-be mediator, and it is that the United Nations, as any other would-be mediator, has to be acceptable as a mediator or as a third party or as a good officer by the parties concerned, which implies that the government of that state has to agree to it. That's number one. The second is that an intergovernmental body with the legal ability to do so, the legal power to do so, should support the Secretary General's role. Now, under Article 99, the Secretary General, of course, has the latitude to conduct inquiries to see whether a matter may threaten international peace or security, and in that process, it is perfectly acceptable for the Secretary General to explore whether there might be a role for him or one of his envoys in addressing it. But when it comes to the point of actually starting an effort, within a very short time, the Secretary General would be wise to go to the Security Council and get some sort of proof of blessing, or at least inform them of what he's doing, and so that the Security Council doesn't object. But it is very delicate, and I can tell you, based on experience, that in situations of internal conflict, and if the negotiation is between a government and a non-governmental entity, such as an insurgent group, it is very difficult. There are sort of national sovereignty issues, there are legal issues involved to accept a role by the United Nations, in particular, because it could entail a political legitimization of the group that is insurging, because the Secretary General, as any mediator, should be perfectly impartial. Chemically pure impartiality is required by the Secretary General as any other mediator, and that's difficult for the established institutions. Sorry.
Over here in the second row, and then over there, and then we'll go to this side, and then we'll go back and then to the back.
Hello, my name is Rania Massoud. I'm from L'Orient Le Jour newspaper. I have two questions. First, where do you think the Middle East peace process would be today if in fact the United Nations mediation was more seriously involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And second, how impartial can a mediator be, especially in a long or too long conflict such as in the Middle East? Thank you.
Well, the first is very much a hypothetical question, and it's very difficult. I mean, I practically have to write a dissertation solely to answer that question. I'm not sure whether I want to venture down that particular path. as I say, one of the requirements is that the parties have to agree, and certainly in the case of Palestine, they have agreed, and it's not the UN that's in the lead. In the case of Lebanon, it's different. In the case of Lebanon, what you have is an all too frequent phenomenon, which is proliferation of would-be peacemakers. And actually, the United Nations, I think, in a quiet and discreet way, is not only in contact through the Secretary General's representative here with all the parties, but also acceptable as an interlocutor by all the parties. One frequently would like to establish some sort of a rule of the game, a certain ethos between would-be peacemakers. It's very difficult to establish because, of course, peacemaking is not high-tech. Almost any diplomat fancies himself potentially a peacemaker, and reading the newspapers and seeing what, let's say, Geir Pedersen does in Lebanon and says, well, I can do that. It's not difficult to do, and so it's very tempting frequently to jump in, and there's nothing worse for a mediation exercise than the proliferation of would-be mediators. They get in each other's way, they trip each other up, and the parties play them off one against the other. So that's with respect to your question. What was your second question? Well, that's a very difficult problem to handle. At the start, of course, the parties have to accept whoever it is. If they won't agree to a particular mediator or good officer, well, it won't happen. Now, as of that moment, if the Secretary General and his envoys conduct themselves with impartiality, that is, in accordance with the Secretary General's view of how a matter should be handled, having in mind the backdrop of the Charter and UN law and Security Council resolutions, the parties should accept, no matter what he does, an envoy of the Secretary General, and understand that sometimes judgments have to be exercised. But as a practical matter, I would say that there may be, and it's very difficult to calculate this, certain limits to the shelf life of an envoy. There are problems that can be associated with long-term excessive proximity to a problem. It's a problem that arises in diplomacy in general. I think it's the British that we refer to it as going native. And, you sometimes are too close to it. And it's, which is why, I mean, it's always a difficult choice. Do you have the envoy resident, which is probably necessary when there is a volatile situation in place, or do you have someone coming from the outside, a sort of knight in shining armor? That's a delicate choice. But the presumption has to be that the mediator is impartial and will always conduct himself in accordance with the rules of impartiality that I was referring to earlier.
Thank you. I'm Josh Koseifi. I worked 30 years with the United Nations in the development field. I have two questions. My first question is, based on your experience with the quartet, do you think really that UN can play an independent role these days? I would refer my own reading of the quartet declaration is they are trying to water down the resolution of General Assembly and Security Council. Give you one example. Take the issue of settlement. Until today, the settlements by UN resolutions are illegal, whether in East Jerusalem Golan Heights, whatever, in West Bank and Gaza. If we take the quartet statements, we realize that there are requests to stop settlements, but nothing is done about the previous settlement. Nothing, no one is talking about what exists already, as if the Palestinians have to deal with the fait accompli. So, based on your proper experience, do you think really that the UN can play an independent role in this quartet and in this is one question. The second question, I believe the UN should have its own definition for terrorism and should make a clear demarcation between terrorism and national liberation. We cannot, in this particular region of the world, we cannot confuse national liberation and terrorism. This is what is happening partly in Palestine and partly in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you. With respect to the first, what the quartet does is establish a distinction between settlements that were, let's say, either accepted or encouraged or condoned or subsidized by the State of Israel, and the settlement outposts that have cropped up since without authorization by the State of Israel. Now, the latter, Israel considers illegal. Now, there's a problem with that, because if you refer to illegal outposts, it gives the impression that the others are illegal, which is, of course, not the case. But the distinction is made in order to establish a sort of a priority, which was actually part of an understanding that was reached a few years ago at Sharm el-Sheikh, under which, and this is reflected in the quartet's roadmap, which has been endorsed by the Security Council, one of the first things that Israel is expected to do is to dismantle the outposts, the settlement outposts, which it has not authorized itself. But that hasn't happened, of course. But also, at the same time, it should freeze settlement activity, meaning further construction, even sort of by demographic growth, within the settlements that the State of Israel promoted and accepted. Now, can the United Nations play an independent role in the quartet? Yes. But the problem is that in order to agree with the others, with the other members of the quartet, you either compromise or no positions are agreed. Or the Secretariat, the Secretary General, agrees to a compromise and states the UN's position himself. Unfortunately, the latter has not happened enough to my taste in the last year or two. So there is a problem there that has to be, I believe, reflected on very carefully, and I hope that will happen. I remember Palestinian officials saying to me shortly after I arrived in Ramallah, they said to me, "What's the UN doing in the quartet? We don't need the UN to mediate. We have the United States. We work with the Americans, and they can deliver Israel. The UN should get out of the quartet and be the UN, and be, in other words, a kind of a mouthpiece for United Nations resolution." He had a case. But at that time, still hoping that he could play a role in order to influence the actions of Israel's allies, and to keep within the confines of legality and human rights and morality the solution that might emerge one day. The second point that you have made is, well, you have made a point. There have been attempts over the years. I remember that Secretary General Wartime in the early 70s proposed to the General Assembly that it should adopt a definition of terrorism. Of course, it didn't get very far. Negotiations took place for literally decades, they came pretty close as a result of the recommendations of an intergovernmental panel a few years ago. But clearly, the context matters. But there are certain actions, deliberate attacks of non-combatants, of civilians, with an intent to kill, are, I think, by any definition, terrorist acts, and they cannot be condoned. But, at the same time, let me add that we have to ask ourselves, we have to dare to ask ourselves, despite the stigma to which I was alluding earlier, why it is that people resort to such horrendous, censurable, condemnable actions, and why is it that they have frequently such strong support? And if you don't ask yourself those questions, let's say where these people and their supporters, who are frequently very, very numerous, where they are coming from, what makes them tick, and if you don't try to address the issues that are of their concerns and their aspirations, well then, we are continuing to provide, reap more such terrorists. As Kofi Annan said in a speech a few years ago, if you don't address the concerns on behalf of which terrorists purport to act, I'm paraphrasing here, you become, we become recruiting sergeants for terrorism.
Okay. My name is Sama Ihia. I'm former full-time UN staff member and presently on a part-time freelance basis also with UNESCO. And again, it's a question on the Middle East, which is naturally our main concern of the audience here, and even those who don't come from the region, I'm sure agree with me that it's one of the thorniest issues in the world, not just in the region. I'm going to, at the risk of being repetitive, I'm going to ask a question I asked a year ago to Mr. Geir Pedersen, who was one of the panelists. It was on 6 October, and he had said, and I'm sure I have no doubt it's out of courtesy and politeness, that he said he had no answer to my question. I'm grateful to his politeness and courtesy, but it's a question still on my mind, and I still would like to have an answer, because so far I haven't found the answer. What would it take? What is it? Is it a flaw? Is it a gap that must be filled in chapter number 7 of the Charter of the United Nations to get them to get Israel to comply with Resolution 242, which we all know is the one single most critical condition for peace in the region, and which would save a lot of headache to the Palestinians, to the Israelis, and to the whole region, which was issued unanimously 40 years ago and approved even by US strongest ally. What is it that prevents the UN Secretary General from being 100% chemically impartial and tell the United States that you're a member of the United Nations, therefore you have agreed to abide by all the laws and by the Charter of the United Nations? How come is it so easy and very swift and very fast to impose sanctions, to enforce UN resolutions on other countries that disobey? And this particular resolution that was issued 40 years ago, 1967, we are in 2007, well, we are still waiting, and we might be waiting for another 40 years.
Thank you.
From your wealth of experience, in your opinion, just what does it take?
Well, Resolution 242 essentially sets out principles for solution of the Middle East conflict. It's not readily enforceable under the terms of Chapter 7. But in any case, let's say, the Secretary General doesn't need to bring the Middle East to the attention of the Security Council, because it already is. You could, I suppose, argue whether it's doing the right thing about it or not, but it's already, let's say, on its agenda and subject to the rules under which the Security Council operates, of course. The implementation of the wide array of measures that are available to the Security Council is a quintessentially political decision that is up to the members of the Security Council, and we know how the Security Council is conformed. This is one of, it's not the only case where the Security Council has held back from carrying out timely action. I mean, you could point to cases such as the early stages of the genocide in Rwanda. You could talk about the early episodes such as the siege of Dubrovnik, that if the United Nations might have taken a forceful action at the start, or a coalition of the willing with the blessing of the Security Council might have actually averted the conflicts that ensued. In the case of the Middle East, you are talking about a party, Israel, whom you named, that has one of the most powerful armed forces around. Now, the United Nations doesn't have forces of its own, and I sort of ask myself as a practical matter, assuming that there were something, let's say, tangible to enforce, how many countries would be prepared to provide forces in order to try to enforce a given solution. So I don't like Jesuitically to answer a question with another, but that's how awkward it is. I mean, I share your impatience and your frustration, sometimes your desperation, almost exasperation, but I'm not sure that this is the kind of conflict that lends itself to the kind of solution to which impatience might lead you.
I work in their offices and so on and so forth. So it's great to have rules and regulations, and it's great that there be this hypothetical separation and so forth. But do you have any pragmatic recommendations in a world of great power politics post 9/11, where the Secretary General of the United Nations can maintain some sort of unbiased position vis-a-vis great power politics?
Right. Well, I just read to you the relevant article of the Charter, which makes it clear under law that the Secretary General should not receive, are not allowed to receive, must not receive instructions, and also member states are enjoined from seeking to influence even the Secretary General or his staff. I agree that may sound a little bit utopian, and diplomats have wiles and ways, for instance, some of them are particularly adept at innuendo and things like, and other such techniques. Nevertheless, what I would like to do is to find a way to revive the spirit in which these particular provisions of the Charter were conceived. And it is really a very simple reasoning if you stop to think about it for a while. If a major power, for instance, is able to sway in its direction an action of the Secretary General, to persuade, to tilt him in particular in one direction through pressure of some sort, shouldn't he be making shouldn't that major power be making the reasoning that just as this major power has been able to sway him, perhaps on another issue, another major power, not necessarily amicable to the first major power, will be able to do the same. And therefore, ask yourself, what do you want? A Secretary General that sort of is a weak reed that sways in the wind, or someone that can be, that will act in accordance with the Charter, Security Council resolutions, the body of law on which this institute, which has been developed under the aegis of this institution, and that sometimes may not go quite in the direction that you want, but ultimately can be trusted to go in favor of the general interest of what the United Nations represent. Secretary General, after all, I mean, if we believe in the need for human progress, for progress in the way that humanity organizes itself, I mean, going beyond Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, if we believe in that, and if we believe that the United Nations is one more stage in that development, in that progress of human development, and if we believe that a Secretary General who rises somewhat over and above the aggregate of member states, then we want to ensure that this stays that way. Now, I go back to, in answer to your question, and it doesn't resolve the practical question, but I go back to something that Secretary General Pérez de Cuellar said in the Cyril Foster lecture at Oxford on 13 May 1986. He gave a lecture on the role of the Secretary General. And one of the things that he said, I could even bring it up on my screen and read it to you, he said that the impartiality is absolutely vital. It's not dispensable. It's not a matter of choice. And member states should realize that it's in the interest of preserving that impartiality. So he throws the responsibility on the Security Council by saying that no one should ever be a candidate for this position, because candidate implies that you're campaigning. And in campaigning, whether or not you are actually doing so, there will always be some question about whether you are entering into some sort of commitment. And that should not be the case. The Security Council should do its job and go about the choice of recommending to the General Assembly for appointment someone for the office of Secretary General. They should take the initiative. The Council should be proactive. It should not just be an election, which is why I believe the Charter doesn't speak about election. It talks about appointment upon recommendation of the Security Council. So that's a sort of a long-term way of ensuring of increasing the likelihood that the Secretary General will indeed always be independent and impartial.
Hi, thank you for the lecture, sir. My question rotates around a lot of what you said about the independence of the Secretary General, but mostly my question rotates at the UN. How can the UN manifest itself as a third-party negotiator when, like Kofi Annan said himself, that it was merely at the whim of the members who are in the UN, the member states? So how can the UN create peace when at the very same time the member states are themselves fighting over the problems that the Secretary General is trying to solve, or the peacemakers are trying to solve? I asked the question because in Lebanon last summer, or the summer of last year, when the UN in New York was trying to reach an agreement over the war, I mean, we used to sit around the TV, Security Council meeting after Security Council meeting, and seeing them get nowhere. And then finally, when they did get somewhere, it was obviously too late after the death toll had risen to a scary number. So how effective is the UN at the end of the day at bringing peace and being a third-party negotiator when its members are the people fighting?
Well, the United Nations, of course, is it's a creation of people and therefore eminently perfectible still. many people criticize the United Nations and certain built-in features such as permanent members of the Security Council and so on and so forth. It's better than not having the United Nations at all, I think, ultimately. What Kofi Annan said was actually correct. There are certain fields of endeavor of the United Nations in which it is very difficult for the UN to play a role unless there is some consensus. Bear in mind, I mean, if you look at the sort of the travaux préparatoires leading up to the UN Charter, you will find that sort of in the thinking of those who proposed the Charter, the four sponsors who are the current permanent members minus France, the idea was that there would continue to be, beyond the actual signature and entry into force of the Charter, a cooperation between the permanent members of the Security Council together with the non-permanent members, a consensus to making sure that things don't get out of hand, that international peace and security will indeed be maintained. That was the whole spirit of the thing. Of course, it broke down rather quickly, as we know, within a matter of a few years. But there are ultimately, if you look also at the Charter, it says that the membership will accept that the Security Council is acting on behalf of the organization as a whole. Now, this is I think, largely unregarded article of the Charter, which I believe actually contains the thought that members of the Security Council, whether permanent or non-permanent, should not be acting in order to promote national interests because they are acting on behalf of the entire membership. That they should be able to rise above that. Is that utopian? Quite possibly. But you have to sort of recover that spirit, and it would be highly desirable if members of the Security Council sort of rose above it and made it a more flexible body in order to bring about a consensus. This is not a satisfactory answer to your question, but let me say so before you think it.
Yaya Saab, I work at UN ESCOM. I'm concerned about the UN's perception of its successful missions in the past, specifically when you talk about El Salvador, for example. If you ask former guerrilleros, they would say that they've lost with that peace deal, and that they, even though you say that they're integrated, they would think that the right-wingers are the one who have the upper hand. What is the danger of this discrepancy between attitudes towards peace arrangement, where they could possibly relapse into war because of all the frustration they feel that they've been left out? And my second question regards the possibility of incompatibility between peace and justice. Again, going back to Latin America, they have an elaborate international human rights legislature and an active regional body such as the OAS, which ensures the manifestation of Peace and Reconciliation Commission. What would you say about the Middle East? And is that possible here, where human rights is not necessarily on the top of the agenda, and also that there's absolutely no respect for international humanitarian law? Thank you.
On your first question, I think we will be talking to different guerrilleros, perhaps. In January, I attended a rather large ceremony, which was also attended by 7 or 8 heads of government from neighboring countries in Latin America, in San Salvador. And together with Secretary General Pérez de Cuellar, and by unanimous decision of the Salvadoran legislature, he and I received sashes, ribbons, and medals for our work to bring about a situation in which you had a legislature that could achieve such a result. Now, I mean, it's a question that you can debate. Have the peace accords solved every problem that the Salvadorians face, such as grinding poverty and persistent injustice and inequitable distribution of wealth? Certainly not. But what the United Nations, I think, has helped them to agree on is a framework within which that can be brought about, and that can be brought about without having to resort to death squads or bombs. Well, that's one. How do you measure success? That's a very difficult question to answer. It's lasted 15 years, which is not bad. Incompatibility between peace and justice. I wouldn't agree that there is an incompatibility. I think that you can reconcile the two, and that in fact, if you don't have at least a framework, if not specific provisions to ensure justice as part of a peace agreement, that the chances of durability and sustainability of that peace agreement diminish drastically. So I believe they've really got to go hand in hand. I think you sort of went into a broader question in the Middle East. That is a pervasive problem. It's a problem, particularly the one that's related to international humanitarian law, which, of course, the ICRC deals with to a large extent, but which is concerns those that are involved in the work of peace at the United Nations as well. And I don't think that there's any claim that by anyone, certainly not the United Nations, certainly not by me, that there's any satisfaction with the way things are unfolding.
We have to leave exactly at 2, so I would ask you please to make the questions very short, and we'll get more people being able to ask questions.
Samir Khouri, I have a question to you, Mr. De Soto. You referred in your closing remarks to the negotiators' dilemma when a major actor in a conflict is excluded from the dialogue, the peace dialogue which is taking place. And here I'm referring to Hamas. Now, could you elaborate on this dilemma, because it's an important one? Would a track to a solution or other ways of bringing those actors who are excluded into the negotiation be a solution? Or what other solution would you, can you tell us about? Thank you.
Well, let's say as a starting premise, the more inclusive a solution is, obviously, the better chances of success it has. And in fact, you could argue that if you're excluding a group that represents, if not a majority, at least a large bulk of the population that's involved in the conflict, any agreement that is reached will be, let's say, would be short-lived. In the case of Hamas, well, I believe that perhaps an opportunity was missed. I don't know really what Hamas is pursuing. If I look at their covenant, quite frankly, I take no comfort from it at all, because I think it's a pretty awful document. But I note the fact that in the course of its campaign leading up to the legislative elections of January 2006, nobody invoked the covenant except the opponents. And they had a different campaign platform. I note also that shortly after taking over the presidency, shortly after his election to the presidency, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, within 2 months struck an agreement with the factions, including Hamas, which included several elements, including the convening of elections and Hamas agreed to participate, and that there would be what they called a hudna, or taqliya, let's say a lull in combat, and that Hamas largely respected that, even as recognized by people from the IDF that are spoken to the Israeli Defense Forces. I also remember the fact that they participated in elections. They had refused to participate in earlier elections because they were in the framework of Oslo. I saw that those were at least signs that they were moving toward a direction in which it would be possible, if they continued in that direction, to deal with them and to actually forge some sort of agreement that might have to be done stage by stage, starting with a mutual ceasefire. So it's my view that perhaps we missed a trick at some point and should have found a way of encouraging that. Now, as you can probably deduce from what I've said earlier, I believe that the UN could have played perhaps a useful role in engaging with them, and there was certainly no legal objection to doing so, since they were the elected government of the Palestinian Authority, in order to encourage them in the right direction, as we have done in many other cases in different parts of the world, in at least 3 continents. Now, the international community took a different tack, and we may have missed an opportunity there. I don't know whether it's irreversible or not. I fear that a government, that a movement that has a history of terrorist acts, which they don't deny, and in which obviously taking the steps that I've referred to a moment ago probably required a lot of very tough internal deliberation, in which, at least at that moment, the forces of engagement and moderation and reconciliation and possibly peace prevailed. I hate to think how they have interpreted the attitude of the international community, and I would hate to think that the result of this is that they were going to go back to what they were doing before. I hope that this will not be the case, but I think that possibly the international community as a whole, or at least as embodied in the quartet, may have a certain responsibility if that is what happens.
Maha Al-Azhar, I work at AUB. I remember you mentioned in Saturday's meeting that peace envoys are usually chosen to be as far from a conflict as possible, in general from the area. There are exceptions, as you were in El Salvador, but in general. If we should consider the UN as a peacemaking and peacekeeping body, wouldn't it be logical if we follow this standard to exclude those members of the Security Council who have the most at stake in a conflict? Because I think that last year in Lebanon's war, if the US and Israel were not voting, we would have had a peace earlier and faster to save many lives. So I know it's probably utopian and a rhetorical question, but do you think that anyone is considering some kind of creative reform at the UN that might improve its peacekeeping, peacemaking activities? Thank you.
Well, members of the Council under the Charter who are parties to a dispute are expected not to be involved in decisions of the Security Council. That's from a strictly legal point of view, but that's not, of course, the question that you've asked. Israel is not a member of the Security Council. The United States is a member of the Security Council, but it wasn't, strictly speaking, a party to the dispute. It's a difficult question to answer, because you are talking essentially of ideals, further stages in sort of the progress of human organization. Reform of the Charter is difficult enough already. particularly on the structure of the Security Council and its decision-making criteria and powers. So, I mean, that is something that requires, I think, quite a bit more further study.
Richard Chambers from IFAS. One of the common responses to a post-conflict scenario is to hold elections as quickly as possible. What happens when those elections go wrong and the loser rejects them, or, as happened in Cyprus, the population rejected in referenda the options put forward?
Well, there's been perhaps an excessive temptation to equate elections with democracy. But, of course, elections do not a democracy make. It should be a broader concept, though they are, of course, relevant and important. You have posed a very serious question. I don't have a ready answer to it. If you send something to the voters, you are putting yourself at the mercy of the voters, and you've got to accept. For instance, in Cyprus, which you mentioned, the UN drew up a plan which was based on a sui generis negotiating process in which we reflected the principles that had been agreed upon, 30 years ago by the parties, a bizonal, bicommunal, federal solution, and we produced just that. But whereas the Turkish Cypriots voted by about 2-1 in favor of it, the Greek Cypriots voted 3-1 against. But we have to accept that. Ultimately, it's the people who decide.
My name is Andrew Vincent from AUB. I have two very short questions. The first one is, I wonder if you could comment on the role of former Prime Minister Tony Blair as a kind of super representative of the quartet. The second one concerns your leaked report of May. Did you leak it? And if not, do you know who did?
On your second question, twice no. On your first question, Mr. Blair has been appointed by the quartet. He's barely begun his work. Let's hope he does well. He brings two very important assets. One of them is his enormous talents as a politician, and another is his experience regarding Northern Ireland, which is not irrelevant.
This question goes back to a remark you made. I'm Saul Benjamin, professor of history at ACS, previously a senior advisor to President Clinton and President Mandela on reconciliation issues. You mentioned Churchill's remark, some Churchill's remark, too much history, too little geography. Could I add a third? What about courageous leaders?
But are you qualifying that? Too many or too few?
Given your mileage on the insights you've earned, history, geography, leaders, there's some compelling tension between these. I'm wondering if you have any insights.
Well, there's a great quote from Bismarck. Yes. My German is rusty, but I can attempt a paraphrase. What is the definition of a statesman or a leader, as opposed to ordinary politicians? It is a politician who hears the hoofbeats of the horse of history, leaps into the saddle, and seizes the reins. Now, I'll leave it to you and others to decide whether there are such leaders in place at this time to take the kind of decisions that will be required.
Nothing less cynical than that? Since you cited Bismarck.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it is entirely cynical.
It's a dinner conversation.
Yes, a dinner conversation, exactly. There's another very good quote from Bismarck regarding the Balkans, of course, but that's a very famous one. I'm sure you know it, if in case anybody's curious. He said, and that was, I suppose, the Balkans are not worth the healthy bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. The policy of non-involvement. Sorry, to really answer your question, yes, leadership is required. You need men or women of stature, people who actually lead and are not taking the pulse on a daily basis of public opinion to see what would fly.
And I should be more fair, because one of the things that strikes me, I'm sure it strikes people with greater understanding of this remarkable but self-vexing part of the world, the last names of so many of the leaders are still the last names from 40 years ago and still today. And I just wonder about, well, you can see where that goes, the mentoring of generations of people who are perhaps more articulate about the future as much as they are articulate about the past.
Well, sometimes leaders come out of nowhere and are not necessarily sort of scions of dynasties, and one perhaps if there isn't that leadership coming from the establishment, that more such figures will emerge where they are needed.
Hello, my name is Omar. I'm a grade 11 student at ECS. I just wanted to go back to a few years ago at the massacre of Ghana. And as a normal human being, not as an ambassador or as a diplomat, as a normal human being, would you see that as an act of terrorism on that specific day? If yes, why not act? And if no, why not?
As I recall, during that incident, the Secretary General was asked to carry out an investigation, and he appointed a panel that carried out an investigation, and he made public and put before those who could do something about it that report, which was, as I recall, pretty damning at that time. He got into a lot of hot water as a result. I was naturally as shocked and as appalled as everybody else was by that. Unfortunately, I have since had the occasion to be shocked and appalled many times.
I think we're going to bring this to a close because we need a few minutes to clear the room. I would like to thank Alvaro de Soto for coming and sharing his views with us and for launching our series. Thank you very much.